Welcome to the debate. Imagine sitting down for a really high-stakes examination, like one that could determine whether you get accepted into your dream university or, secure a visa to immigrate to a brand new country.
Yeah, the pressure in that room is just immense.
It really is. Now, imagine being told that to achieve a nearly perfect score on this test, your answers do not actually have to be flawless.
Which honestly sounds entirely counterintuitive, right?
Exactly. I mean, we expect diagnostic assessments to be binary. The math equation is right or it's wrong. But in the world of language testing, that expectation gets remarkably complicated.
It gets complicated because you're trying to quantify something that is inherently fluid, organic. Evaluating human speech in real time is a monumentally complex task.
Right.
You can't just put a conversation under a microscope and count the grammatical errors like you're counting bacteria on a slide.
And yet, that is exactly what millions of people are preparing for when they walk into the IELTS speaking test. For beginners engaging with our analysis today, IELTS, which is the International English Language Testing System, is arguably the global standard for measuring English proficiency.
It really is the gold standard.
Yeah. And whether you are taking the academic version or the general training version, the speaking component remains a unified 11 to 14-minute face-to-face interview.
It is the ultimate crucible for language learners. Just you, the examiner, and a ticking clock.
Which brings us to the core disagreement we are examining today. When we analyze the architecture of this test, what is it fundamentally evaluating?
Right, what's the actual goal here?
Exactly. Is the IELTS speaking test primarily a rigorous metric of a candidate's mechanical linguistic perfection, meaning strict adherence to grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation rules? Or is it at its core a test of functional natural communication?
The classic debate.
I take the position that this assessment is a highly engineered structural metric. To cross the threshold from an intermediate speaker, what we might call, a B1 or B2 level up to a band 7 or higher, the test demands a sophisticated, almost mechanical mastery of linguistic architecture.
Well, and I look at that exact same architecture and come away with a completely different conclusion. I view the IELTS speaking test as essentially a communicative exercise.
Really? Just communication?
Yeah. The entire design of this face-to-face interview is built to reward natural, effective interaction over sterile perfection. It's a test of human connection, psychological confidence, and adaptability. It is not some cold audit of syntax.
Well, let's lay out the groundwork for these positions, starting with the mechanical perspective. When we look at the explicit grading criteria provided in the material, the examiners are assessing 4 very specific pillars.
Fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation.
Exactly. And 3 of those 4 criteria are deeply technical. They are hard, objective metrics. To achieve a band 7, which, is often the golden ticket for university admissions or immigration, a candidate cannot just be a charming conversationalist.
But charm definitely helps.
Sure, it helps with the examiner's mood, maybe, but the material explicitly advises candidates to explain your ideas and give examples. You simply cannot do that effectively without complex sentence structures, subordination, and a broad lexical resource.
You mean vocabulary?
Right, the actual depth of your mental dictionary. The mechanics are the foundation. If the foundation is weak, the communication collapses.
I hear your point on the 4 pillars, I really do. But let's test that theory against the explicit philosophical guidance provided in the very same material. It outright tells candidates to, and I quote, focus on communication rather than perfection.
A nice sentiment, but
it's more than a sentiment. It highlights a remarkably interesting fact, one that kind of undercuts the idea of a mechanical audit. You can achieve a high band even if your English is not perfect.
Minor imperfections, sure. There.
I think it is. It places the candidate in a fundamentally human interaction. They want to see if you can naturally and effectively convey an idea, even if the structural beams of your grammar are slightly asymmetrical.
Okay, I understand why you prioritize that guidance. It sounds very forgiving. But I think we need to look at how that 11 to 14-minute format actually operates in practice.
Fair enough, let's look at it.
Because I would argue that the structure itself is a highly engineered mechanical stress test designed to break down a candidate's linguistic facade.
Oh, come on. I wouldn't call a simple conversation a stress test. It's an interview.
But it's an escalating interview. Look at the tree parts. For beginners out there, part 1 is 4 to 5 minutes of introduction and personal questions. Things like, where are you from, or what do you study?
Right, small talk, which is exactly how a natural conversation begins.
Yes, it lulls the candidate into a false sense of security because it accesses the highly practiced, everyday vocabulary they are most familiar with.
Okay, but then
we hit part 2, the cue card. This is where the underlying mechanics are exposed. The candidate receives a random topic, gets exactly 1 minute to prepare, and then they must speak for 2 continuous minutes.
it's definitely a challenge.
It is psychologically and neurologically demanding. This is where the cognitive load maximizes. Sustaining accurate grammar and retrieving varied vocabulary for 2 unbroken minutes in a second language is incredibly taxing on working memory.
Right. You're juggling a lot.
You're simultaneously planning your next thought, accessing the vocabulary, applying morphological rules, and monitoring your own speech for errors.
I completely agree that the working memory is severely taxed here. 2 minutes feels like an eternity. But you're misinterpreting the purpose of that taxation.
How so?
By the time they reach part 3, which is another 4 to 5 minutes of discussion with more detailed questions, the candidates' rehearsed structures are entirely exhausted.
That assumes they are just rehearsing. Most are. And the cognitive load from part 2 ensures that in part 3, superficial fluency breaks down. It exposes the candidate's true base-level grammatical limitations. It's an engineered exhaustion.
See, you are interpreting the escalation from part 1 to part 3 as a trap, like it's some sophisticated way to catch a candidate dropping a verb tense.
Not a trap, a diagnostic tool.
Well, I see it as a brilliantly designed simulation of real-world communicative demands.
A 2-minute monologue on a random cue card about, say, a memorable childhood toy isn't exactly a daily real-world demand.
But the underlying skill is, in the real world, whether you are defending a thesis at a university or, pitching a project in a boardroom, you have to hold the floor.
Okay, that's true.
You have to explain a concept without someone constantly prompting you or rescuing you when you stumble. So, a practical tip for beginners, that 1 minute of preparation in part 2 isn't a cognitive trap. It's a realistic opportunity to organize your thoughts.
And what about part 3?
Part 3, the material explicitly notes, involves more detailed questions. It tests conceptual coherence in a deep discussion. It basically asks, can you maintain a natural flow of ideas when the conversation gets conceptually complex?
But coherence requires grammar.
It relies entirely on the candidate's confidence to navigate the unknown, not just their mental dictionary of vocabulary. The test pushes you to see if you can keep communicating effectively when the topic gets tough. That is a functional survival skill, not a mechanical one.
But that cognitive exhaustion we just identified in part 2 is exactly why we see the specific penalties enforced on the test. You say coherence is functional, but coherence itself is a mechanical output.
I wouldn't go that far.
You have to. You cannot have coherence without the cohesive devices. The conjunctions, the transition words, the grammatical linkages that hold the thoughts together.
Sure, you need basic glue.
Which brings us to the common mistakes outlined in the material. The penalties listed are highly revealing. Candidates are penalized for very short answers and repeating the same words.
Yes, those are listed.
And why? Because when your brain is tired, what's the first thing to go? Your vocabulary. You start giving very short answers because those mistakes represent a fundamental failure of lexical resource and grammatical range.
I think you're over-indexing on those specific penalties.
If a candidate cannot supply varied synonyms or string together compound sentences under pressure, they are failing the mechanical parameters of the test.
You're kind of cherry-picking the mistakes that support a structural view while ignoring the others.
Let's hear the others then.
Look at the rest of the common mistakes explicitly listed in the source material. Speaking too fast, long pauses, and the absolute cardinal sin of the IELTS, memorized responses.
Which I would argue is penalized precisely because a memorized response doesn't demonstrate spontaneous grammatical generation. If you memorize it, you aren't showing the examiner that you understand the underlying mechanics.
No, it's penalized because it destroys the natural rhythm of human communication. A memorized response might be grammatically flawless, right?
It could be.
It could contain the most sophisticated Band 9 vocabulary imaginable, perfectly pronounced. But if an examiner detects it, the score plummets. Why? Because the test is evaluating whether you can interact natively.
They can always tell when it's scripted.
Exactly. If you've ever sat in that examiner's room, you know the exact tension of a candidate reciting a script. Speaking too fast or utilizing long pauses are failures of rhythm and confidence. They aren't structural errors, they are communicative barriers.
So you're saying they fail because they sound like robots?
Yes. If you are just reciting a perfect essay, you aren't communicating. You are essentially a tape recorder, and a tape recorder doesn't get a band 7.
Okay, I'll grant that a tape recorder doesn't get a band 7. But let me push back on this idea of rhythm and confidence. If the test is truly just about communicating naturally, couldn't someone naturally and confidently communicate using very basic, repetitive, rudimentary words?
Well, they'd have to be clear.
The material tells candidates they must explain your ideas and give examples. Doesn't the very requirement to construct an explanation mandate a higher level of structural grammar?
Not necessarily.
Come on, you cannot explain the nuances of public transportation funding with just nouns and basic verbs, no matter how confident your rhythm is.
You absolutely can communicate a complex idea with simple words. In fact, some of the most effective communication in the real world is stripped of complex jargon. The goal is to be understood.
But this is an academic test.
Let's use an analogy. Think of a natural conversation like hosting a dinner party. At a dinner party, if you use the wrong fork, people might notice, but the conversation continues.
Okay.
But if you stop talking for 30 seconds to frantically try and remember the word for fork, the party grinds to a halt.
So true.
The test grades the flow of the party, not the cutlery. If you are clearly and naturally conveying your point using B1 level vocabulary, but with absolute coherence and smooth pacing, you will score remarkably well because you kept the party going.
I love the analogy, but eventually the guests are going to need a knife.
Oh, please.
Seriously, let's test your dinner party theory against the reality of the material. The material advises candidates to stay calm, to avoid those long pauses. The pause happens because a candidate's mental hard drive is crashing while trying to conjugate a verb or search for a specific piece of vocabulary. You say they should just keep the party going. How?
By using circumlocution.
Explain that for our beginners.
It's talking around a word you don't know. The pause happens when the candidate becomes obsessed with finding the perfect word instead of just using an effective workaround. If they let go of the need for mechanical perfection, like the material explicitly advises, they could just explain the concept using the simpler words they already have.
But that's still a workaround.
It's functional. The test rewards the candidate who confidently says, "I can't remember the exact word, but it's like a small river," rather than the candidate who sits in agonizing silence for 10 seconds trying to retrieve the word stream.
Okay, that is a fair distinction. Circumlocution is a completely valid, real-world communicative strategy.
Thank you.
But doing it successfully still requires immense grammatical ability.
Does it?
Yes. You still have to construct the relative clause, "It's like a small river that flows down a mountain." You are substituting a vocabulary deficit with a grammatical flex. So either way, the mechanics are saving you.
Yes, but it utilizes the tools you have internalized naturally, rather than treating the language like a math test where there is only one correct formula. Remember the material's explicit note, you can achieve a high band even if your English is not perfect.
But not perfect doesn't mean full of errors.
But if the IELTS were primarily a mechanical evaluation, imperfections would directly and severely correlate with score capping. The fact that the system tolerates imperfection in grammar and pronunciation as long as the communicative intent is clearly and naturally delivered proves that the functional outcome is the priority.
I don't disagree that minor imperfections are tolerated. I mean, even native speakers make grammatical errors, leave sentences unfinished, or stumble over pronunciation in spontaneous speech.
All the time.
However, there is a strict threshold. The assessment criteria explicitly grade grammar and vocabulary as 50% of the total score. 50%?
It's a big chunk, yeah.
To achieve a band 7, the density of those imperfections must be incredibly low, and the structural complexity must be demonstrably high. We don't have to guess at this because the material provides us with a specific Band 7 sample answer to analyze.
Ah, yes, the infamous sample answer.
Let's deconstruct it, because I think it perfectly proves my point about mechanics. The examiner asks a very standard Part 1 question. What do you enjoy doing in your free time?
A classic softball question.
Right. Now, listen closely to the prescribed Band 7 response from the material. In my free time, I enjoy reading books and going for walks. Reading helps me learn new ideas, while walking allows me to relax after a busy day. I usually spend at least an hour on these activities every evening.
It is beautifully simple, almost shockingly simple.
Is it simple, or is it highly structurally optimized? Look beneath the hood at the mechanics. The speaker doesn't just list activities. They synthesize them.
They just said they read and walk.
No, they said, reading helps me learn new ideas, while walking allows me to relax. That use of the subordinating conjunction while establishes a complex grammatical relationship of contrast and simultaneous benefit within a single sentence.
You're treating a basic conjunction like it's advanced linguistic calculus.
It is advanced when speaking spontaneously. Then, they conclude with a precise frequency statement. I usually spend at least an hour on these activities every evening. It flawlessly fulfills the mandate to explain your ideas and give examples.
I mean, sure, it follows the prompt.
They utilized a sophisticated grammatical framework to deliver a complete multi-layered thought. If they had just said, I like books, books are good, I like walks, walks are relaxing, they wouldn't hit Band 7 even if they said it with a warm smile and perfect confidence.
You are proving my point by focusing so intensely on the word while. Look at the actual vocabulary in that Band 7 example.
What about it?
Free time, reading books, going for walks, relax, busy day. There is not a single obscure, high-level vocabulary word in that entire response.
The grammar is the star there, not the vocabulary.
No one is using words like plethora or ameliorate. The magic of that sample answer isn't in its mechanical complexity, it's in its natural delivery. It sounds like something a real human being would actually say to another human being over coffee.
But it demonstrates a rigorous mastery of the underlying rules.
It demonstrates an internalization of the language, which is entirely different from mechanically applying rules. Let's look at the list of key vocabulary the material provides for candidates to understand their goals.
Go ahead.
Fluent, confident, opportunity, achievement, effective, communicate, improve, natural.
I see where you're going.
Notice a pattern. How many of those words relate to the psychological state of the speaker rather than the structural output of the speech? They want you to be fluent, confident, and natural.
Which are hard to measure.
The practical tip given to beginners is to stay calm and practice every day. Why? Because daily practice builds the psychological state of fluency. When you are calm, your affective filter lowers. You don't stall. When you don't stall, your coherence naturally improves. The mechanics follow the confidence, not the other way around.
I argue the exact opposite. The confidence follows the mechanics.
Really?
Yes. You cannot stay calm in a 14-minute face-to-face interview under the pressure of university admission unless you have absolute subconscious trust in your grammatical foundation.
Which brings us back to the human element. The presence of a human examiner looking you in the eyes is the defining variable of the IELTS speaking test.
It is a unique format.
If they wanted memorized essays or perfectly constructed subordinating conjunctions devoid of human rhythm, they would just give you a written test. They would hand you a piece of paper and say, write down your thoughts on walking.
The writing section does exactly that, yes.
Right. So the fact that they put you in a room with a human being means they are testing your ability to connect with one.
The human element is merely the medium for the test. It is not the rubric. I think the implications of our disagreement are profound for anyone actually preparing for this exam.
How so?
If we follow your functional philosophy, a candidate should spend their time chatting in cafes, focusing on eye contact, managing their anxiety, and learning how to confidently talk their way out of a vocabulary deficit.
Which I would argue is exactly what they should do to succeed.
Whereas if we follow the structural philosophy, a candidate must recognize that charm will not save them. They need to sit down and rigorously drill complex grammatical forms, conditionals, passive voice, relative clauses, until those structures become automatic enough to survive the cognitive exhaustion of Part 3.
Well, we can certainly both agree that daily practice is the undeniable prerequisite for success here, regardless of the approach. For anyone listening, whether you're a beginner or aiming for that Band 7, you just have to put the time in.
Absolutely. And I think we also find total convergence on the danger of memorized responses. Whether you view a memorized response as a mechanical failure because it lacks spontaneous grammar, or a communicative failure because it lacks genuine human interaction, it is universally fatal to a high score.
Oh, completely. It undermines the entire purpose of the assessment.
Which brings us back to where we started. The tension in this material reflects the broader tension in language learning itself.
It really does.
As we summarize our positions, I stand firmly by the interpretation that the IELTS speaking test remains a rigorous academic and linguistic assessment. To bridge the gap from an intermediate level to a Band 7, a candidate must strictly adhere to grammatical and vocabulary standards.
Even though they say focus on communication.
The ability to effectively explain ideas and give examples under the immense cognitive load of a 14-minute escalating interview relies entirely on an underlying mastery of linguistic mechanics. The structure is the bridge. And if it is poorly engineered, the candidate falls.
And I maintain that the 14-minute face-to-face crucible ultimately reveals that true language proficiency is about the confidence to communicate ideas naturally. The test explicitly instructs candidates to prioritize communication over perfection.
We'll have to agree to disagree on which matters more.
That's the beauty of it. It evaluates whether you can take an unexpected prompt, stay calm, and deliver a coherent, effective message, regardless of minor structural imperfections. It is a test of whether you can keep the dinner party going, even when you forget the word for the fork.
It is a fascinating duality. We ask candidates to build a perfectly engineered linguistic bridge, but we only seem to grade them on how gracefully they walk across it.
Or perhaps we just care that they reach the other side, and we are willing to forgive a few missing bolts along the way if their stride is confident enough.
Exactly. It reminds me of the diagnostic dilemma we discussed at the beginning. We want the comfort of the X-ray, the clear black and white image of what constitutes the perfect language learner. We want to point out a grammar mistake on a rubric and say, there is the fracture.
But language doesn't live on an X-ray. It lives in the breath, in the pauses, and in the dynamic, imperfect connection between two people sitting across a table.
And somewhere in that 14-minute span, the examiner has to decide exactly what kind of proficiency they are looking at. A fascinating challenge for both the tester and the tested.
So for everyone listening who is preparing for this test, keep practicing, stay calm, and find what works for you.
Yes, keep up that daily practice because it will pay off. Thank you for engaging with us on this and leaving us all with plenty to consider. If you found this breakdown helpful, be sure to subscribe to the show for more deep dives into the mechanics and mysteries of the systems that shape our world.